Welcome to Topic 2 of Block 2. Having answered the key prerequisite questions about who the evaluation is for, which decisions it will inform, and who the different user groups' perspectives might be, this topic will describe why it is important to and how to clearly define the scope of the activity being evaluated. For the evaluation to provide useful results, we need to be able to define exactly what it is that we think the intervention involves, and therefore which aspects of the activity are thought to have particular intended effects. An example of this would be providing an information sheet to patients about physical activity in order to increase activity levels. Here, the intervention could either be just the action of giving the patient the information, or could necessarily involve the action of giving the information plus that information being read and understood by the reader. In this simple example, if the patient does not read the sheet, has the intervention failed or had no effect? Or did they actually, in fact, not receive the intervention in the first place because not all aspects of the intervention were delivered? In other words, both giving and reading. While this is obviously a simplistic example, it's vital that the intervention has clear boundaries in order for us to be clear about what it is that is having an effect on the outcomes and how this occurs. Logic model is a useful way to clarify exactly what is being evaluated and how the activity being evaluated will have an impact. Ideally, by the time an evaluation begins, the intervention will have been fully described. A logic model is a diagrammatic representation of an intervention. It describes how various resources will be used in action to implement the intervention, what the various intervention components are, and what the mechanisms are through which the intervention will achieve its intended aims. By specifying the inputs and outputs of the activity under investigation, it can help clarify the boundaries of the intervention. In addition, in order for the intervention to have its desired influence on outcomes, the assumptions being made should be made clear. For example, that the person being given the information sheet both reads and understands the content. By explicitly deriving a model of how intervention activities link to outcomes, you may also identify where stakeholders have differing understandings of the intended intervention, or reveal where there are weaknesses in the intervention designs. For the purpose of defining the activity to be evaluated, it's useful to populate the logic model with the inputs, in other words, the resources required to implement the intervention, and outputs, in other words, the activities and/or participation involved in carrying out the intervention. In the simple example of the patient information sheet, the inputs would include nursing staff and information sheet materials and design. Outputs would be interaction between nursing staff and patients, distributing the information sheet, and patients reading the information sheet. We'll come back to the logic model in the next topic when we specify the evaluation questions. The logic model doesn't need to be particularly advanced or take long to sketch out. Here's an example of a logic model used to define the intervention to be evaluated in the example of the case study 1, community-based NHS health checks. Here you can see that the intervention is more than simply providing NHS health checks in community settings. It also involves workshops with community partners, training health champions and patient focus groups. If we hadn't included all of these things in our definition of the evaluation intervention, it would not be clear which aspects were influencing outcomes and through which mechanisms. Before you specify the evaluation questions and select a design to use, it's important to consider what the possible constraints are. This might include time, money, resources, knowledge, or a combination of these. For example, if in the case of the community health check, you wanted to understand whether and how workshops with community partners increase uptake of NHS checks, you might need to interview various partners, workshop leaders, and patients. But to do this successfully, you must ensure that you have enough time and expertise to organise, carry out, and analyse those interviews. Clearly, the amount of money allocated to the evaluation is likely to influence what can be achieved in the time frame available. For example, resources needed for data collection could include questionnaire development, printing, and mail-out costs, online survey development, and so on. Aside from being clear about the budget availability for the evaluation, it can be useful to develop a Gantt chart to sketch out the timeline of various evaluation activities, working backwards from the deadline for findings. It's important to think about the timing of when the findings are likely to be made available, as this will influence whether or not they are likely to affect decision making. Gantt charts are also useful to think about how resource requirements are spread over the course of the evaluation timeline, for example to identify periods when additional resources or expertise might be needed. For the practical for this topic, try sketching a logic model of the intervention you are planning to evaluate, or choose one of the other case study examples if you don't have a particular project in mind. In particular, what are the activities involved which define the intervention, and what inputs are needed for the activities to be implemented? Next, complete Proforma section F, which is about logistics, in your Google Doc Proforma.